So, welcome to George Washington Domestic Policy. And again, domestic simply means at home. You'll hear the phrase domestic dispute, domestic violence, okay, ugly stuff, but again, domestic simply means at home. Going through this is a quick review of Washington's previous roles prior to functioning as our first president. Initially, Washington gets his fame, gets known from being the war hero, the head general for the American Revolution. And later, after winning the Revolution, defeating the British, Washington will go into retirement. He had always been away fighting the war, but now he gets to go home. These are some of his best years. And so it's at his home in Mount Vernon in Virginia that ultimately, after many years of this, he will get called out of retirement because the Articles of Confederation, as we know, will fail. And at Shays' Rebellion, they finally realize they have to make a change, and they call the Constitutional Convention. Washington will come out of retirement and serve as president. And finally, after debate, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists trying to figure out how to structure this government, they will ultimately agree on the new U.S. Constitution, and Washington will be asked to serve as president, and he will take on the role. He was nervous about it, and this wasn't his favorite job because being president is not easy. And so to begin with, a lot of us don't understand, a lot of Americans don't understand that the first capital of the United States under the Constitution was in New York City. And so you are looking at Federal Hall, where George Washington was sworn into office on a Bible. They ran down the street, grabbed a Bible from the Masonic Lodge, brought it back, literally just threw open the pages, and Washington put his hand down on it. The verse was not important, Genesis 49 something, and so there was nothing important behind it, but he gets sworn in, and that becomes a precedent that presidents follow ever since. And so you can see here, this is Federal Hall with Manhattan and Wall Street all throughout the background. And so if you ever go to New York City today, and you go down to Wall Street, you're going to run across Federal Hall while you're down there with Wall Street and the World Trade Center. And so not only is it where Washington lives for a year, within this building is also where Congress meets. And so Washington during this first year will take on many of the problems that are going to need to be faced by the early republic. And so among these problems, the first is that after fighting war is expensive, and this was a very lengthy and expensive war. And so America comes out of this with $50 million in debt. Adjusted for inflation, today that would be the equivalent of something in the order of $2 trillion. America has a weak financial system. It has no national currency. There's no dollar bill as we have today. All the states had been printing their own money. And so Connecticut had its own money. New York had its own money. Now they're going to want one monetary unit for the nation, a dollar. And so there's no regular military. You have people who serve in the military, but they're volunteers. And after they're done volunteering, they go home. They're not professionals. Westward expansion. America is expanding westward into Native American territory. And then additionally, you have over in Europe, you have the outbreak of the French Revolution that's ultimately going to cause Europe to sink into open warfare. And of course, as always, France and Great Britain are going to be fighting again. And they will both want us to support them. And so among some of these early problems and issues to take care of was the Northwest Ordinance. And again, the Northwest Ordinance regulated how to essentially settle these westward lands as America works to achieve its manifest destiny of moving westward. And so the big issues relate to the Native Americans that are already there. And even though the British have lost the war and in some ways gone away, they're still in Canada, and they begin to provide guns, weapons, to the Native Americans to resist our westward expansion. Washington sends troops to help end the dispute. Also, 1789, in that first year, there's not many details in the Constitution about how to set up the American court system. And so they will pass a bill, a law, that structures all the details about how to set up the American court system. Very importantly, it establishes the Supreme Court, it establishes federal courts and state courts. And also, very importantly, it makes sure that the federal courts are supreme, more powerful than the state and local courts. And so, in keeping with this, we want to talk to you briefly about the Supreme Court as it gets set up. The initial Supreme Court had 6 Supreme Court justices. Today we have 9. You're looking at our current 9 justices in the picture in the background. Washington appoints John Jay as the first Chief Justice. So the Chief Justice is the head of the Supreme Court. And then every other justice is the Associate Justice. As you can imagine from the picture, the person sitting in the middle right here is our current Supreme Court Chief Justice. And so you'll see off to the sides are all the other Associate Justices. And again, usually these are older people. Ginsburg right here is 87. The gentleman over here is 82. And so Judge Roberts, who's in the middle, okay, he is in his mid-50s. And so the Supreme Court initially has very little power, and that is going to change, and it has changed big time. And so after a year, the government will move to Philadelphia. And so we've talked this to death. In the background of the image at the top, you can see a building that we've talked about several times now, Independence Hall, which obviously gets its name from the Declaration of Independence that was decided upon in Independence Hall. And so, of course, as we know, this is also the place where they have the Constitutional Convention. It's maybe the most important historical building in the entire United States. And so, Independence Hall will now be the home of Congress. And so it is there that they'll meet and decide bills and laws. And right here in the foreground of the image, this was the presidential mansion. Now, about 10 years ago, this wasn't even there. This is recently constructed. But based on the archaeology and based on them going through, it was very clear that they had the foundation, the base foundation of the building was there, and they simply decided to add new framework so that you could see what the presidential mansion back then looked like. And so this is fairly recent, and it does a good job not only showing this was where Washington lived inside this building, but also this was where his slaves were as well, and it kind of speaks to both. And then in the middle right here is, of course, this is where they keep the Liberty Bell, and over here is Independence Mall, this walkway. And so among the first things that happen in Philadelphia that serves as our capital for the next 10 years, from 1790 to 1800, among them, okay, will be Washington's cabinet. Again, they're going to be constructing Washington, D.C. while they are ruling in Philadelphia. And so you are looking at Donald Trump here in the center of the table, okay, having a meeting with his cabinet. Today's presidential cabinet has 16 members. The first presidential cabinet had only 6. And so we look back at this first cabinet appointed by Washington, and we look at this group of guys like, in many ways, some athletes look at the USA basketball, okay, the Olympic Dream Team from 1992 that had Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, Larry Bird. Okay, this is the greatest group of men in a cabinet that we think has ever been around in the United States. Okay, the most important, arguably, among them is the Secretary of the Treasury, which was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton will set up our financial system for the United States. Extremely important. The Secretary of State is in charge of foreign policy, and that'll be Thomas Jefferson. And Hamilton and Jefferson, they're going to become bitter political enemies, rivals, which is going to lead to political parties. We'll talk more about that. Knox is in charge of the military as Secretary of War. And so the Vice President, John Adams, okay, serves as well. The Vice President is always a member of the Cabinet. And all the Cabinet does is simply give advice to the President. And so again, it's Jefferson and Hamilton who become the two biggest rivals and the two that we will talk about more than any other related to the President's first cabinet. Okay, and again, so Hamilton's extremely important, and we will get into more detail about Hamilton and his life. Hamilton was an orphan from the Caribbean. And basically, he gets to the United States. He doesn't have anything. He's running a business by the time he's a teenager. He's going to get wealthy. He comes to the United States. He's young. Washington discovers this kid, immediately puts him in charge of parts of his army. Hamilton impresses Washington in everything that he does. And he is just an extremely brilliant guy who kind of comes up from nothing and makes something of himself. And so the musical is obviously very popular. Some of you guys are familiar with it and some of you are not. And obviously you know how the Hamilton story ends, is that Hamilton will end up in a duel with Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr will shoot him dead. And that is coming later, and we will talk more about that. But Hamilton's biggest contribution, the reason that we study him so much, is because he sets up our financial system. And the first task that he had at that time was paying off America's war debt. Hamilton wanted the federal government to take on all of the states' debts. The northern states had a lot of debt. The southern states had largely paid theirs off. The southern states thought it was stupid that they would have to contribute in some way by allowing the federal government that they're a part of to take on all of these northern debts. To them, it didn't make sense. It rewarded the North's bad behavior of taking on debt. Hamilton's going to have to craft a compromise out of this, but he's going to get them to do it. And he knows that if they can get the federal government to control the debts, that when they pay it off, it will be good for the creditworthiness of the United States. Here's why that's important. In order to take out loans, as governments need to do, as people need to do, whether you take out a loan for a house, take out a loan for a car, take out a loan to go to college, you need to show that you are creditworthy. And so Hamilton is trying to pay off that debt to make the federal government look creditworthy. Additionally, Hamilton will create a protective tariff. The protective tariff will benefit largely the northern states. He's trying to protect American industry. He believes that by taxing foreign goods coming into the country, that it will make American goods more competitive. And so Donald Trump today has been using tariffs as well. Tariffs go way back, and Hamilton used them to raise taxes and to protect American industry. The South, again, has a problem with this part of the financial plan. The South doesn't have industry, so it doesn't benefit them. And when they buy things, oftentimes from overseas, they're having to pay more. And they don't like that. It hurts their economy. And so Congress will get new taxes out of this. Okay, but also Hamilton needs to raise even more revenue. He needs to create even more taxes. And so America being a nation of farmers, he comes up with a way to tax farmers, and that's placing a tax on whiskey. Most farmers would have excess grain that was left over when they weren't converting that, turning that into bread. And so with that excess grain, they would turn it into whiskey and sell it for a profit. The farmers are not going to like this tax on their whiskey. The third thing Hamilton will do is also going to be extremely controversial, and that is create a national bank. You are looking at the first national bank in Philadelphia. You can see it's not really in good shape. It's a cool looking building, but it looks a little ghostly. That's because no one's in it, because ultimately this bank is going to be killed. Okay, Hamilton will get the national bank created, but immediately you're seeing people oppose the bank because they're concerned about it. They don't think it's constitutional. They think it could actually hurt farmers. They think it could actually hurt people. And so the bank is going to continue to be very controversial, and we will talk more about it. So, almost through with this. Okay, we get to the compromise, okay, related to the nation's capital. They don't know where they're going to place the nation's capital. People in the North wanted it in Pennsylvania. They thought that Pennsylvania would be the center of this new country, especially once we took over Canada. Because, of course, Canada is going to end up as part of the United States. At least that's how some people thought. Well, meanwhile, the South wanted it down closer to the South. And so Hamilton, in order to get support for taking on this national debt, he will give the South what they want, and he will give the South the American capital. And so Washington, okay, named after George Washington, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, okay, will be set up in Virginia, on the border between Virginia and Maryland, two southern states. And so we put the capital in the South. The main road that you'll see between Congress and the White House today is called Pennsylvania Avenue. It kind of goes back to again, the northern hope of having Pennsylvania as the capital. And so, finally, one of the big final acts that Washington has to deal with while he's president is the Whiskey Rebellion. I told you that the farmers of the United States were not happy. And what results is that farmers in western Pennsylvania will take up arms, okay, and they will march, okay, onto courthouses. They will attack tax collectors. When Washington hears about it, he immediately recognizes this could be another Shays Rebellion. This could kill the Constitution the same way that Shays killed the Articles. Washington knows that he must respond with full force. And so he rides out there, okay, with the army, and the farmers get scared, and they largely go away. And so that is what ends the Whiskey Rebellion.